Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClair, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. And before we're through, you'll understand why his name still echoes through every juke joint, every prison yard, every dusty crossroads where the South keeps its secrets. Now, I've told you tales of voodoo queens and ghosts that won't rest. But this story? This one's about something just as powerful. Twice. Not with magic, mind you, but with a 12-string guitar and a voice that could make the devil himself weep for mercy. See, down here we say music's got power. Not the kind preachers talk about on Sunday morning, but the old kind, the kind that runs in blood and bone, and that rises up from soil soaked in suffering and comes out sounding like freedom even when you're chained to a wall. Ledbetter knew that power better than most. He was born into it, bled into it, and eventually, Lord have mercy, he used it to cheat the hangman's rope. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. Back to the borderline between Louisiana and Texas, where the land's so flat you can see tomorrow coming, and yesterday leaving at the same time. It was January 1888, or maybe it was 89. Records get fuzzy when black folks are born on plantations when Huddie William Ledbetter came into this world screaming. His mama, Sally, said he had lungs like a steamboat whistle even then. His daddy, Wes Ledbetter, worked land that had been slave quarters just 20-some years before. Freedom had come, sure, but it wore shackles you couldn't see, sharecropping, debt, and the knowledge that white men still owned everything that mattered. They lived in Mooringsport, Louisiana, right on Caddo Lake, where the cypress trees grow so thick the water turns black as coffee. It's a place where the air hangs heavy with heat and history, where the line between Louisiana and Texas blurs like a fever dream, and where every song you hear carries the weight of 100 years of sorrow. Young Huddie grew up listening. That's what folks forget. Before he ever picked up a guitar, he was listening. To the field hollers his daddy sang while working the cotton. To the spirituals his mama hummed over the stove. To the work songs that drifted across the lake from the lumber camps. To the accordion squeeze of Creole music floating up from the bayous. All of it mixing together in the thick southern air like ingredients in a gumbo nobody wrote the recipe for. By the time he was 5, he could carry a tune better than grown men. By 7, he was making his own instruments out of cigar boxes and wire. His uncle gave him an accordion when he was 8, and Huddie made that thing cry like it had lost something precious. The boy had a gift, that much was clear. But gifts down here always come with a price tag attached. See, talent like that draws attention, and in the Jim Crow South, attention could get a black man killed faster than anything else. But Huddie, he wasn't the type to keep his head down. He was tall, strong-built, with hands that could swing an axe or pluck a string with equal ease. He had his daddy's work ethic and his mama's pride, and somewhere in that mix was a temper hot as a branding iron. The Ledbetter family moved around some Lee, Texas for a spell, then back to Louisiana. Wes Ledbetter managed to save enough to buy his own small patch of land, which was saying something in those days. Not many black families made it from sharecropping to ownership. But Wes was determined his children would have something more than cotton rows and white men's favors. Huddie, though he had other ideas about his future. By his teens, he was slipping away to Shreveport's red light district, a place called Fannin Street where the blues were born in back rooms and bordellos. The district hummed with danger and desire, whiskey flowing like water, dice rolling on wooden tables, women in bright dresses leaning against door frames, and music, Lord, the music pouring out of every crack and crevice. It was there Huddie met the old bluesmen, the ones who'd been singing since Reconstruction. They taught him the 12-bar blues, showed him how to make a guitar moan like a woman or cry like a man facing judgment. He learned to play the Sugarland, the Gray Goose, songs about convict work gangs and men who died in chains. He didn't know then that he'd be singing those songs from the inside looking out. Around 1903, when he was barely 15, Huddie got his hands on a proper guitar, 6 strings at first, before he discovered the 12-string that would become his signature. That instrument became an extension of his body. He could make it sound like 2 guitars playing at once, rhythm and lead woven together so tight you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He played at house parties, at dances, at fish fries down by the lake. White folks and black folks both would hire him, though they'd never dance in the same room. He'd play all night sometimes, fingers bleeding, voice hoarse, and when the sun came up he'd stagger home with a pocket full of coins and a head full of melodies he'd made up on the spot. But music wasn't enough to pay the bills or satisfy the restlessness growing in his chest. He worked the cotton fields alongside his daddy, hands moving fast between the bowls, but his mind was always somewhere else, on that next song, that next town, that next pretty woman smiling at him from the front row. Huddie married young, still in his teens, a girl named Aletha Henderson. But marriage couldn't tame him any more than his mama's prayers could. He was a man built for motion, for trouble, for the kind of life that doesn't fit inside neat lines. The marriage lasted about as long as a match in a windstorm. By 1910, Huddie was known up and down the Louisiana-Texas border as one of the best guitar players around. But he was also known for something else, his temper. Quick to fight, quick to defend his pride, quick to pull a blade when words ran out. In those days, being a black man with pride was dangerous. Being a black man with pride and a knife was asking for a grave. He carried 2 things everywhere, his 12-string guitar and a pistol. Said he needed both to survive, and for a while it looked like he might be right. But the South's got a way of testing a man. And Huddie Ledbetter's test was coming, riding toward him like a freight train in the dark. See, this is the part of the story where the music stops being joy and starts being survival, where entertainment becomes testimony, where a song ain't just something you sing, it's something you pray with everything you've got left. Because in the Deep South, justice was a word that changed depending on the color of your skin, and for Huddie Ledbetter, justice was about to come calling with a noose in its hand and hate in its heart. But we ain't there yet. First, you need to understand the man before you can understand the music. You need to hear the borderline in his voice, Louisiana's cypress swamps mixing with Texas's open plains. You need to feel the weight of those cotton sacks and the ache in those calloused hands. You need to smell the smoke from Fannin Street and taste the whiskey that burned all the way down, because that's where the blues come from, friend. Not from happiness. From the exact opposite. From the place where pain meets pride and what comes out is something so honest it could shatter glass. Huddie Ledbetter was born on the borderline between 2 states, between slavery's end and segregation's rise, between the music that saved souls and the violence that ended them. And somewhere in that in-between place, he learned to sing like his life depended on it. Because soon enough, it would. They say every man's got a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, both whispering in his ear. But Huddie Ledbetter? He had a 12-string guitar in one hand and a pistol in the other, and sometimes he couldn't tell which one would speak for him. By 1915, Huddie was living the life of a traveling musician, drifting between Texas and Louisiana like smoke through a screen door. He'd play anywhere that would have him juke joints, dances, logging camps, private parties for white folks who wanted to hear a real bluesman but wouldn't shake his hand afterward. The money was never steady, but the music was, and that seemed like enough. He'd taken up with Blind Lemon Jefferson by then, one of the greatest blues singers Texas ever produced. They'd travel together, 2 black men with guitars and dreams too big for the Jim Crow South to hold. Blind Lemon would sing in that high, keening voice that sounded like spirits crying through a keyhole, and Huddie would back him up on that 12-string, making it ring like church bells for the damned. They'd set up on street corners in Dallas, in front of the courthouse or outside saloons, passing the hat while white folks walked by pretending not to listen even though their feet were tapping. The police would run them off sometimes, tell them to take their noise somewhere else, but most days they'd make enough to eat, enough to drink, and enough to keep moving. Blind Lemon taught Huddie something crucial: how to put your whole life into a song, not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. How to make a guitar cry when words wouldn't come. How to turn pain into something people would pay money to hear. It was a kind of alchemy, turning suffering into silver, But Huddie had another kind of alchemy working in him too, the kind that turned whiskey into rage and pride into violence. See, down here in those days, a black man had to swallow his pride so many times it became a habit. Step off the sidewalk when a white woman passed. Say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, even to children if their skin was lighter than yours. Take whatever insult came your way and smile like it didn't cut. That was survival. But Huddie Ledbetter wasn't built for swallowing. He had a backbone like an iron rail and a sense of dignity that wouldn't bend. And in 1915, that combination was a recipe for disaster. The trouble started, as it often did, over a woman. Her name was, well, the records don't agree, but let's call her what the old-timers called her, Trouble in a Sunday Dress. She was married to another man, but Huddie didn't much care about that. When he wanted something, consequences came second to desire. They'd been carrying on quiet-like, meeting when her husband was working the cotton gin, stealing moments in the shadows where the South kept all its secrets. But secrets in small towns have a way of walking into the light. One December night, Huddie was playing at a house party outside Marshall, Texas. The air was cold for that part of the country, frost threatening on the cypress branches. Inside, the room was warm with bodies and music, smoke from hand-rolled cigarettes hanging like morning fog. Huddie was halfway through a song, fingers dancing across those 12 strings, when the door slammed open. The woman's husband stood there, and he wasn't alone. He had his cousins with him, 3 men, all carrying the kind of rage that builds up slow and explodes fast. The music died like somebody had cut its throat. The husband didn't waste time with words. He came at Huddie swinging, and Huddie, well, he'd never backed down from a fight in his life. The 12-string went flying, and what happened next was the kind of violence that leaves scars on more than just skin. Fists flew, bodies crashed into furniture. Women screamed, men shouted, and somewhere in the chaos, Huddie pulled his pistol. The first shot echoed like thunder in that small room. The second one quieter, almost polite in comparison. When the smoke cleared and the shouting stopped, one of the cousins was on the floor, bleeding from his shoulder. The husband was clutching his side, eyes wide with shock. And Huddie Ledbetter was standing there, gun still in his hand, knowing his life had just changed forever. He ran. Didn't stop to explain, didn't wait for the law. He grabbed his guitar and disappeared into the East Texas night, heading for the one place he thought might offer protection back to Louisiana, back to Caddo Lake, back to land he knew like the lines on his palm. But the law moves faster than a guilty man, especially when that man is black and the victims are white adjacent. Within days, they had him. The local sheriff, a man named Joe Dixon, tracked him down to a relative's house and brought him in chains to the Harrison County Jail. The trial was quick. Too quick. In Texas in 1915, justice for a black man accused of shooting white men wasn't about evidence or testimony, it was about setting an example. Huddie stood in that courtroom knowing the verdict before the judge opened his mouth. His lawyer, court-appointed, half asleep, barely put up a defense. Assault with intent to murder. Guilty. 30 years hard labor. 30 years. He was barely 30 years old, and they'd just taken his life away. 30 years in a Texas prison farm meant most men never saw freedom again. It meant dying slow, piece by piece, under the whip and the sun, and the endless crushing weight of chains. They shipped him to the Shaw State Farm, later known as Imperial Farm, one of the notorious Texas prison plantations where convict leasing was still alive and kicking even though slavery was supposedly dead. The farm stretched across thousands of acres of cotton and sugarcane, worked by men in striped uniforms who moved like ghosts through the fields. Huddie learned quick that prison was its own kind of hell. Not the fire and brimstone kind preachers talk about, but the slow-burning kind where hope dies a little more each day. The guards were white men with shotguns and whips, most of them former Confederate soldiers or their sons, men who saw convicts as free labor and nothing more. The food was barely fit for hogs. The work was dawn to dusk, bent over cotton rows or cutting sugarcane under a sun that felt like God's anger made manifest. But the worst part? The silence. No music allowed except on Sunday, and then only hymns approved by the warden. For a man like Huddie, whose soul was made of melody, that silence was torture worse than any whip. He watched men die, some from heat stroke, some from beatings, some from diseases that swept through the barracks like judgment. He watched men lose their minds, talking to people who weren't there, laughing at nothing. He watched men give up, just stop eating until their bodies followed their spirits into the ground. Huddie decided he wouldn't be one of them. He worked harder than anyone else, made himself valuable, showed the guards he could fix things, repair machinery, handle horses, showed them he was smart, dependable, not the kind to cause trouble if you treated him half decent. It was a survival strategy, make them see you as useful rather than disposable. And slowly, carefully, he started bringing his music back, then singing quiet-like, under his breath. The other convicts heard him and joined in work songs that kept rhythm with their hoes, songs that made the days pass faster, songs that reminded them they were still human even if the law treated them like animals. The guards noticed. Some didn't like it, saw it as insubordination. But others, the ones who understood that music kept men working longer, kept them from going crazy, they let it slide, and eventually, Huddie was given back his guitar. Not his 12-string, they wouldn't allow that, but a beaten-up 6-string somebody's relative donated to the prison chapel. It wasn't much, but it was everything. On Sunday evenings, they'd let him play in the yard, gospel songs mostly, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord, Amazing Grace, hymns about suffering and redemption that hit different when sung by men in chains. The guards would stand at the edges, rifles across their chests, but even they'd go quiet when Huddie played, because there was something in his voice, something that transcended bars and skin color and the cruelty of the world, something that said, I'm still here, you can chain my body but you can't chain this. He sang about freedom even though he'd likely never see it again. He sang about women and whiskey and trains heading north. He sang about men who died in the fields and men who'd never die because their songs lived on. He sang the blues like they were testimony, like God himself was in the jury box taking notes. And somewhere in those long Texas nights, between the work and the whip and the weight of those 30 years stretching ahead like an endless cotton row, Huddie Ledbetter started to understand something that would save his life. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was power. It was the one thing they couldn't take from him. It was currency more valuable than gold, because it could buy what nothing else could mercy. He just had to figure out how to spend it. The other convicts started calling him Lead Belly, some say because he was tough, some say because he'd survived a shotgun blast to the belly in another fight. That story may be half legend, but legends grow in the dark. Whatever the reason, the name stuck. Huddie Ledbetter was dying in chains. But Lead Belly was being born, and Lead Belly was going to sing his way out of hell. There's a sound that haunts the deep south if you listen close enough. It ain't the wind through the pines or the call of the whippoorwill. It ain't even the slow roll of the Mississippi carrying secrets to the Gulf. It's the sound of men singing in chains, voices rising from prison farms and work gangs, turning suffering into something so beautiful it'll break your heart clean in half. That's the sound Lead Belly learned by heart, by 1916. He'd been at Shaw State Farm long enough to understand the rhythms of prison life. Wake before dawn to the clang of a bell. Work till your hands bled and your back screamed. Eat slop that barely counted as food. Sleep on a wooden plank with 100 other men, all of them dreaming of freedom they'd probably never see. Then wake up and do it all again, day after day, year after year, until either your body gave out or your mind did. But Lead Belly had found his angle, music, the warden, a man named T.J. Wallen was a hard case, former military, believed in discipline through suffering. But he'd also figured out what every plantation owner before him knew. Singing men work harder. Music keeps rhythm. Rhythm keeps production up. And production was what the state of Texas cared about, not the souls of the men producing it. So Lead Belly became, in effect, the prison's unofficial music director, on work details, He'd lead the call and response songs that made the hours pass one. A man singing a line, the others answering back, all of it timed to the swing of axes or the chop of hoes. The guards loved it because the work got done faster. The prisoners loved it because it made them feel like men instead of mules. He sang the old work songs he'd learned as a boy. Take This Hammer, about the legendary John Henry who died with a hammer in his hand. Midnight Special, about a train that carried freedom in its headlights. Shorty George, about a man too mean to die easy. He sang songs older than slavery, African rhythms that had crossed the ocean in the bellies of ships, mixed with Scottish ballads and French hymns, all of it fermenting together into something new, something that sounded like America's guilty conscience put to music. But he also started writing his own songs about life inside, about guards who were cruel and guards who were halfway decent, about men who tried to escape and men who died trying, about nights so long you could taste the darkness, about dreams that kept you alive even when living felt like dying. One of the prisoners who worked alongside him was a young man named Irving, convicted of theft, scared out of his mind and barely 18. Kid couldn't hold a tune, but he hung on every word Ledbetter sang. One night, lying in the barracks after lights out, Irving whispered, "How you do it? How you stay strong?" Ledbetter was quiet a long time before answering. "Music ain't about staying strong," he said finally. "It's about staying honest. You sing what's true, even if the truth is you scared, even if the truth is you broken. You sing it, and it don't own you no more. You own it." Irving nodded in the dark, though Ledbetter couldn't see it. The next day, Irving tried to run, made it 3 miles before the hounds caught him. They brought him back and made an example 20 lashes while the whole camp watched. Ledbetter had to watch too, had to hear the boy scream. And that night, while Irving lay on his stomach moaning, Ledbetter sang soft and low, a song that sounded like a mother's lullaby, like all the mercy the world didn't have. Irving died 2 days later from infection. They buried him in the prison cemetery without a marker, just a wooden cross with a number carved in it. Ledbetter wrote a song about him. Can't remember the words now, but the melody was slow and sweet, like a river carrying something precious away. See, that's what people don't understand about the blues. They think it's about being sad, but sadness is just feeling sorry for yourself. The blues is about bearing witness. It's about saying, this happened, this was real, this mattered, even if nobody else remembers. It's history written in melody, sung by folks whose names will never make it into the history books. Ledbetter was writing the history of men like Irving, of men like himself, of every black soul who'd ever picked cotton or swung a hammer or sang to keep from screaming. And in doing that, he was keeping them alive in the only way that lasts in song. But music couldn't change the fact that he was still a prisoner with 25 years left on his sentence. Couldn't change the ache in his bones or the scars on his back or the knowledge that he'd be an old man if he lived that long before he breathed free air again. That knowledge ate at him. Some nights he'd lie awake and feel time pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. 25 years. How many songs could he write in 25 years? How many men would he watch die? How many times would the sun rise and set on him still in chains? He'd sing himself to sleep, humming fragments of melodies that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Somewhere in his blood and bone where memory lived. And then, in 1918, something happened that changed everything. The warden announced that Governor Pat Neff was planning a visit to inspect the prison farms. It was a political thing Neff was running for. Re-election. Wanted to look tough on crime but fair on reform. He'd tour the facilities, meet with administrators, maybe talk to a few prisoners if he felt generous. Ledbetter heard about it and had a thought that felt like lightning touching down in his skull. Governors had power to commute sentences, grant pardons, show mercy, and if there was one thing Ledbetter understood, it was how to move people with his music. He'd seen it happen 100 times, men who'd been angry or sad or drunk or mean, their faces softening when he played, women crying into their hands at dances, guards setting down their rifles for just a moment, lost in a song. Music could do what words couldn't. Music could slip past defenses and touch something soft inside that hardened world couldn't reach. So Leadbelly made a plan. A crazy, desperate, probably doomed to fail plan. But what did he have to lose? Another 25 years of hoping he'd survive long enough to die free? He started working on a Panis song. Not a blues song this time. Not a work song or a spiritual. A petition set to music. A plea dressed up in melody. He'd sing directly to the governor, ask for mercy in a way no written petition could match. He worked on it for weeks, refining the melody, getting the words just right. It had to be respectful but not servile. Had to acknowledge his guilt but ask for compassion. Had to be the kind of song that stuck in your head, that you'd hum without meaning to, that would lodge itself in your conscience and not let go. The other prisoners thought he was crazy. Man, you think a song gonna get you out? You think some white governor from Austin gonna hear you sing and say, well, hell, let's pardon this convicted killer? You dreaming. Maybe he was. But dreams were all he had. Dreams and a 12-string guitar he'd gotten his back by then, earned it through good behavior, and a voice that could make stones weep. When the day came, he was ready. They'd set up a little stage in the Redbins of a yard for the governor's visit, some chairs for the officials, the prisoners arranged in rows like they were at church. Warden Wallen gave a speech about rehabilitation and reform. The governor nodded politely, sweating in his suit under the Texas sun. Then the warden said, "We got one of the finest musicians in the state system, Governor. If you'd care to hear him, I think you'd be impressed." Governor Neff waved his hand, generous. "By all means." Leadbelly stood up, guitar in hand, legs shaking just slightly. This was it. One chance. One moment between dying in chains and maybe, just maybe, seeing the sky as a free man again. He took a breath, felt the weight of every man in that yard watching him, felt the sun on his face and the strings under his fingers, felt the ghost of every song he'd ever sung sitting on his shoulder, whispering, "Make us proud." And then he played. The sound that came out of that 12-string guitar was like nothing most of those men had ever heard. It rang clear as a bell, deep as a well, bright as hope and sad as a funeral. And when Leadbelly's voice joined it, the whole world went quiet just to listen. He sang his petition, sang about redemption and second chances, sang about the mistakes he'd made and the man he wanted to be, sang about mercy not as a gift but as a reflection of the mercy we all hope to receive from God. He sang like his life depended on it, because it did. The prisoners sat frozen. The guards stood still, and Governor Pat Neff, hard-nosed politician from Austin who'd heard every sob story and plea imaginable, leaned forward in his chair, eyes locked on this tall black man with a guitar, singing his heart out under a merciless Texas sky. When the last note faded, the silence lasted long enough to hear a bird calling from somewhere beyond the razor wire. Walked over to where Leadbelly stood, looked him in the eye. That, he said quietly, was something else. He turned to the warden. "Get me this man's file." And just like that, hope walked back into Leadbelly's life, carrying a melody in its hands. Now, I want you to picture this moment right. Not the Hollywood version where everything happens fast and clean. This is Texas, 1918. This is a black man on a prison farm, standing in front of one of the most powerful white men in the state, waiting to hear if a song can do what prayers couldn't. Governor Pat Neff didn't say anything right away. He studied Leadbelly like he was a puzzle needing solving, walked a slow circle around him, hands clasped behind his back, jaw working on a thought too big for quick words. The warden stood nearby, nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. See, Warden Wallen had his reputation to consider. If he'd brought a troublemaker to the governor's attention, that'd reflect poorly. But if he'd recognized a reformed man worthy of mercy, that made him look wise, Christian, forward-thinking. The warden was playing poker too, just with different cards. Leadbelly stood still, guitar hanging from its strap, sweat rolling down his back that had nothing to do with the heat. He'd poured everything he had into that song, every ounce of skill, every drop of soul, and now all he could do was wait while white men decided his fate, same as it had always been, same as it would probably always be. Finally, Governor Neff spoke. "How long's he been here?" "4 years, sir." The warden answered. "Model prisoner, works hard, keeps the men in line with his music. Haven't had a bit of trouble from him." Neff nodded slowly. "And his crime?" "Assault with intent to murder, fight over a woman from what I understand. Shot 2 men, but both survived." The governor was quiet again, thinking, calculating. A politician's mind works like a balance scale. Every decision weighed against how it'll look in the papers, how it'll play with voters, what it says about his character. Mercy's a fine thing when it makes you look merciful. But show too much and folks call you soft on crime. "Tell me something," Neff said, looking at Ledbetter now. "You sorry for what you done?" Ledbetter met his eyes, something you weren't supposed to do but couldn't help in that moment. "Yes, sir," he said, voice steady. "Sorry I let my temper get the better of my judgment. Sorry I hurt them men. Sorry I didn't walk away when I should have. But I ain't sorry I learned something from it. Prison taught me things freedom never could. Such as, that time's the most valuable thing a man's got, and how you spend it determines what kind of man you die as." Ledbetter paused, then added, "And that music can keep a soul alive when everything else wants to kill it." Governor Neff almost smiled. "Almost. You're educated," he said. "Not a question. My mama taught me to read, sir. My daddy taught me to work, and the blues taught me to be honest." Now Neff did smile, small and quick as a match flare. He turned to his aide. "What's our schedule look like?" The aide consulted a notebook. "We're due in Houston tonight for the speech at the—" "Cancel it," Neff said, "or reschedule. I want this man's full file on my desk when I get back to Austin, and I want the pardon board's recommendation within a month." The warden's eyes went wide. The prisoners who'd been close enough to hear started murmuring, and Ledbetter felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not quite hope, not yet, but its cousin, possibility. Neff wasn't promising anything, but he wasn't saying no either. In Texas, that was practically a miracle. The governor started to walk away, then turned back. "Ledbetter, that your name?" "Yes, sir. Huddie Ledbetter. They call me Ledbetter." "Well, Ledbetter, I'm going to tell you something and you'd best remember it. If I go to bat for you, if I stick my neck out and grant you clemency, you'd better make damn sure I never regret it. You understand?" "Yes, sir. I do." "Good. Because I don't. I get fooled twice." And with that, Pat Neff climbed into his car and left Shaw State Farm in a cloud of Texas dust. The next 4 weeks were the longest of Ledbetter's life, longer than any day in the cotton fields, longer than any night in the barracks. He tried not to think about it, tried to just work and play music and not let hope grow too big lest it crush him when it died. But the other prisoners knew. Word had spread through the whole farm Ledbetter sang himself into the governor's good graces. Some men were happy for him, slapped his back and told him they'd known he'd find a way. Others were jealous, muttered about special treatment and Uncle Tom behavior. A few guards who'd grown to like having him around looked worried they'd lose their best entertainment. Ledbetter tried to explain to anyone who'd listen. "I ain't asking for no special treatment. I'm asking for a second chance. That's all. Just the chance to prove I can be more than what I was." But the truth was, he didn't know if he believed his own words. Because the question that kept him awake at night wasn't whether he'd get out, it was who he'd be if he did. He'd spent 4 years becoming Ledbetter the convict, Ledbetter the prison musician. Who was Huddie? Ledbetter the free man. Was there anything left of him? Then, on a cold January morning in 1925, 1 week after Ledbetter's 37th birthday, Warden Wallen called him into his office. Ledbetter walked in, expecting bad news. In his experience, when authority called you in, it usually meant trouble. But the warden was holding a piece of paper, and his face wore an expression Ledbetter couldn't quite read. "Sit down," Wallen said. Ledbetter sat. The warden set the paper on the desk, smoothed it with his palm like it was something precious. Governor's office sent this yesterday. Took me a while to process it, make sure it was real. He looked up. You've been granted a full pardon. Effective immediately. You're a free man, Ledbetter. The words hit like a thunderclap in clear sky. Ledbelly couldn't speak, couldn't move. His brain kept trying to process what he'd just heard, but the meaning wouldn't stick. Free. Pardon. Immediately. You hear me? The warden asked. You're free to go. Aye. Ledbelly's voice came out rough as sandpaper. I don't understand. Why now? It's been weeks since the governor's wheels turned slow, Wallen said. But when Pat Neff makes up his mind, he moves. Says in his letter he was impressed by your musical ability and your apparent reform. Says he believes in second chances for men who've earned them. The warden leaned back. I told him the same thing. You've been a model prisoner, Ledbetter. Haven't caused me a day's trouble. Kept the men working. Kept morale up. If more convicts were like you, my job would be a hell of a lot easier. Ledbelly found his voice. When? When do I leave? Soon as you gather your things. And speaking of which, the warden opened a drawer, pulled out Ledbelly's 12-string guitar. This belongs to you, along with... He counted out $37 in bills. Your wages from the work you did. It ain't much, but it's something. Ledbelly took the money with shaking hands. $37. 4 years of his life, calculated down to $9 and change per year. It should have made him angry. But all he felt was grateful he had anything at all. He stood, guitar in one hand, money in the other, and for the first time in 4 years, looked at Warden Wallen not as a prisoner to a keeper, but as a man to a man. Thank you, he said. Wallen nodded. Don't thank me. Thank that voice of yours. And thank whatever God you pray to that Pat Neff happened to be in a merciful mood. He extended his hand. Good luck out there. And Ledbetter, don't make me look like a fool for recommending this. Stay out of trouble. They shook hands. Then Ledbelly walked out of that office. Through the halls he'd walked 1,000 times, past the barracks where he'd slept, past the fields where he'd worked, through the gates that had held him captive for 4 years. The guard at the gate looked at his paperwork, looked at him, then swung the gate open, and Ledbelly stepped out into the free world. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. The air smelled like cotton and earth and freedom, though that last one might have been his imagination. Everything looked sharper, brighter, like he was seeing colors that didn't exist inside those walls. He walked down the dirt road leading away from Shaw State Farm, guitar on his back, money in his pocket, and a song building in his chest. Not a sad song this time, not a work song or a plea, just a simple melody about a man who'd been lost and now was found, who'd been bound and now was free. He sang it as he walked, voice carrying across the cotton fields where other men were still working, still dreaming of the day they'd walk this same road. And maybe one of them heard it and held on a little tighter to hope, because if Ledbelly could sing himself free, then maybe music really did have power. Maybe a song really could unlock chains that seemed too strong to break. Maybe, in the end, that's what the blues were for. Not to keep you sad, but to keep you human. To keep you believing that tomorrow might be different than today. That mercy might show up when you least expect it. That even in the darkest hole, a voice singing can be a light nobody can put out. Ledbelly was free, and somewhere in Austin, Governor Pat Neff was writing in his journal about the singing prisoner who'd moved him enough to act. Neither of them knew it yet. But this wasn't the end of their story. Just the first chorus in a song that would play again, years later, under different circumstances. Because freedom, Ledbelly was about to learn, was its own kind of prison, and the blues don't stop just because the chains come off. Freedom tastes like honey, the first time you swallow it. Sweet, golden, almost too good to be real. But after a while, if you're not careful, it can leave you with a bellyache and a yearning for something more substantial. Ledbelly found that out the hard way. When he walked out of Shaw State Farm in 1925, He thought the hardest part was behind him. Thought he'd paid his debt, learned his lesson, earned his second chance. Thought he could go back to making music and living the kind of life that didn't end in chains. He was wrong on all counts. See, freedom in the South for a black man with a prison record wasn't the same as freedom for folks who'd never heard a cell door slam shut. Every job wanted references he didn't have. Every landlord wanted someone who wouldn't cause trouble. Every woman's family wanted to know where he'd been and why. The pardon papers Governor Neff signed didn't erase the past. They just made it official that society had to tolerate him now. Ledbetter drifted, Dallas first, playing on street corners for change. Then back to Louisiana, to Mooringsport, where his parents were older and smaller than he remembered. His mama cried when she saw him, held him so tight he thought his ribs might crack. His daddy just nodded, said, "Glad you're home, son," in a voice that carried 4 years of unspoken prayers. But home wasn't home anymore. The place was the same dirt roads, same cotton fields, same heavy Louisiana air, but he was different. Prison had changed him in ways he couldn't explain and didn't want to. He'd lost something in those 4 years, something innocent and irreplaceable, and gained something harder in its place. His music had saved him, yes, but it had also become a reminder of where he'd been and what he'd survived. He played at local juke joints, house parties, anywhere that would have him. The 12-string rang out like it always had, but now there was something darker in the sound. Something that made people uncomfortable even as they danced. The blues were bluer. The work songs carried memories of real work, real chains, real suffering. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was testifying. Some folks loved it. Said Ledbetter played with more soul than anyone they'd ever heard, like he'd been to hell and brought back the sheet music. Others found it too raw, too honest, too real. They wanted entertainment, not reminders of what the South did to men like them. Around 1926, Ledbetter met a woman named, well, let's just say she was pretty enough to make him forget his promises and smart enough to know better than to believe his. They took up together, moved to Shreveport, tried to make something work. But Ledbetter had never been good at staying put, and freedom made him restless in ways prison never had. He'd leave for days, weeks sometimes, playing in Louisiana and Texas, always chasing the next dollar, the next crowd, the next something that might fill the hole inside him. When he came back, there'd be arguments, tears, slammed doors. She wanted stability. He wanted motion. She wanted a man who came home. He wanted to be anywhere but trapped in one place. It couldn't last. By 1930, they'd split up, and Ledbetter was back on the road, guitar on his back and a familiar restlessness in his bones. But the South was changing around him, getting meaner somehow. The Depression had hit, and when white folks are suffering, they need somebody to blame. Black folks made convenient targets. The Klan was riding high again. Lynchings were common as rain, and any black man who seemed too proud or too successful or too damn good at what he did well, that was asking for trouble. Ledbetter kept his head down best he could, played for white and black audiences both, though never in the same room, took whatever pay was offered, even when it wasn't nearly what he was worth, smiled when he had to, stayed silent when that was safer, and poured all his anger and pride and pain into his music where it couldn't get him killed. But then, in 1930, came the incident in Louisiana that would send him right back to hell. The details are murky, changed depending on who was telling the story. What's known is this. Ledbetter was at a party in Caddo Parish. There was drinking, there was music, and there was an argument that turned physical. A man named Records, aren't clear on the name, tried to start something. Words escalated, and Ledbetter, who'd never learned to walk away from a fight, pulled a knife. In the chaos that followed, the man ended up stabbed. Not dead, but hurt bad enough that the law got involved. And when the law found out, the man who'd done the stabbing was Huddie, Ledbetter, recently pardoned convict. They smiled like they'd just won the lottery. The trial was even quicker than the first one. Black man with a prison record attacks a man at a party, didn't matter what the other man had done. Didn't matter that witnesses said it was self-defense. The jury took 20 minutes to convict. The judge took 5 to sentence, 6 to 10 years. Angola prison. Louisiana State Penitentiary, notorious as one of the worst hellholes in the entire South. 18,000 acres of former plantation land, worked by convicts treated like slaves in everything but name. If Shaw State Farm had been bad, Angola was worse. Much worse. Ledbetter was shackled and shipped down to West Feliciana Parish in August 1930, watching the Louisiana swamp roll past the train windows and wondering how his life had come back to this. He'd sung himself out of prison once, walked free into sunshine, believed he'd earned a second chance. And here he was, 39 years old, going back to chains. Angola was everything the stories said and worse. The guards were brutal. The work was crushing. The heat was biblical. Men dropped dead in the fields and were replaced the next day like they'd never existed. Disease ran through the barracks. Violence was common as breakfast. The warden, a man with ice in his veins and no mercy in his heart, ran the place like his personal kingdom of suffering. Ledbetter got assigned to a work gang cutting timber in the swamps. 12-hour days, waist-deep in black water, snakes and gators watching from the shadows, the sound of axes and saws and men gasping for breath in the humid air. At night they were locked in wooden shacks, exhausted beyond sleep, too tired to even talk. But Ledbetter did what he'd done before. He sang. Started with work songs to keep rhythm while cutting. Then, on Sundays, he'd play guitar for the men, gospel songs that made them remember they had souls worth saving. The guards let it happen because, like before, singing men worked harder. And Angola was all about production, how much timber cut, how many fields plowed, how much money the state could squeeze from convict labor. Months passed into years. Ledbetter watched men break, watched men die, watched men lose their minds and start talking to ghosts. He stayed sane the only way he knew how, through music. He wrote new songs about Angola, about the swamp and the suffering, about the levee camps and the long dark nights. Songs that wouldn't see daylight for years but would eventually become classics. He was documenting his own private hell, one verse at a time. Then, in 1933, something extraordinary happened. A man named John Lomax came to Angola. Lomax was a folklorist, a song collector, traveling the South with portable recording equipment looking for authentic American music. He'd heard stories about Ledbetter, the singing convict who'd charmed a governor into clemency and wanted to capture that voice on wax cylinders before it disappeared into history. The warden agreed to let Lomax record prisoners, saw it as good publicity. So one summer day, John Lomax and his son Alan set up their equipment in the prison and started listening to men sing. When Ledbetter's turn came, something clicked. Lomax heard what others had heard but couldn't name: authenticity. Purity. The sound of real blues, real work songs, real folk music untouched by commercialization. This wasn't some city slicker pretending to be from the country. This was the genuine article. A man who'd lived every word he sang. They recorded for days. Ledbetter played everything he knew: blues, ballads, spirituals, work songs, children's songs, songs he'd learned from his mama, and songs he'd made up in his cell. The Lomaxes couldn't believe what they were hearing. This was gold. This was history being preserved in real time. John Lomax looked at Ledbetter after the last session and said something that would change everything. "You're too talented to waste away in here." Ledbetter, who'd heard promises before and knew how little they meant, just nodded. But something in Lomax's eyes looked different. Not pity, not charity, just recognition of something valuable that was being thrown away. Lomax went back to his hotel that night and wrote a letter to the governor of Louisiana about a prisoner with a voice that could represent the state's musical heritage to the world, that could bring prestige and recognition. That was, and he chose his words carefully, too important to keep locked away. He didn't ask for a pardon outright, just suggested that clemency might be in Louisiana's best interest. Made it sound like business, not mercy. Governor O.K. Allen, who was looking for good publicity and positive press for a state with a brutal reputation, read the letter with interest. He ordered Ledbelly's file, reviewed the case, and in August 1934, after Ledbelly had served just under 4 years of his sentence, Governor Allen commuted it. Ledbelly was free again. 43 years old, twice pardoned, twice rescued by music from a fate that should have killed him. John Lomax was waiting at the prison gates when Ledbelly walked out. "How'd you like to come work for me?" he asked. "Travel the country. Play music. Help me collect more songs like yours. I can't pay much, but it's steady work and you'd be doing something important." Ledbelly, who had 37 cents and nowhere to go, said yes before Lomax finished talking. And just like that, Ledbelly went from convict to folklorist's assistant, from prisoner to performer, from chain gang to concert hall. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Fame was coming, and with it complications he never expected. But for now, walking out of Angola into the Louisiana sunshine, guitar on his back and John Lomax shaking his hand, Ledbelly allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his song really had saved his soul, twice. Now here's where the story gets complicated, where glory and grief tangle up together like kudzu on a fence post. Because freedom and fame are cousins, but they don't always get along at family dinners. When Ledbelly left Angola in 1934, he stepped into a world that wanted his music but wasn't quite sure what to do with the man who made it. John Lomax saw him as a discovery, a living artifact of American folk music, something to be preserved and presented like a museum piece. Ledbelly saw himself as a musician who'd finally gotten the break he deserved. Neither was entirely right, and the friction between those two visions would shape the rest of his life. The Lomaxes, John and his son Alan, took Ledbelly on the road. They toured universities and folk music societies, presented him to audiences of educated white folks who'd never heard the blues except as distant entertainment. Ledbelly would perform in his prison uniform at first, because Lomax thought it added authenticity and made him seem more real. The crowds loved it, loved the exotic danger of a reformed criminal singing songs from the chain gang. Ledbelly hated every second of it. He wasn't a performing seal. He was a musician, an artist, a man who'd survived things most of those audience members couldn't imagine. But he needed the money, needed the exposure, needed Lomax's connections to get his music heard. So he swallowed his pride and played the role. The noble savage, the reformed convict, the authentic Negro folk singer. In private, though, the arrangement chafed, like ill-fitting shackles. Lomax treated him somewhere between an employee and a curiosity, paid him wages but controlled his image, his bookings, his career. Ledbelly wanted artistic freedom. Lomax wanted preservation of folk traditions. They argued constantly, mostly about money and control and what it meant to be authentic. But the music, Lord, the music was undeniable. Ledbelly's repertoire was vast, hundreds of songs, some traditional, some his own, all delivered with that powerful voice and that 12-string guitar that sounded like an entire band. He could play blues, gospel, folk ballads, children's songs, work songs, protest songs. His fingers danced across those strings like they were having a conversation with God. One song in particular started gaining traction around 1934. It was called "Good Night, Irene," a waltz-time ballad about love and loss that Ledbelly said he'd learned from his uncle. The melody was haunting, sweet and sad at once, the kind of song that gets in your bones and won't leave. When he played it, even the hardest hearts softened. But back then, in the mid-1930 seconds, "Good Night, Irene" was just another song in his massive catalog. Nobody knew it would eventually become one of the most recorded songs in American history. Nobody knew it would make millions for other people while Ledbelly died broke. The relationship with the Lomaxes eventually soured completely. By 1935, Ledbelly and John Lomax had a falling out over money and control. Ledbelly wanted to be treated as a partner. Lomax saw him as a subject of study. They parted ways bitter, though Alan Lomax would remain a friend and advocate for years to come. Ledbelly struck out on his own, moved to New York City in 1937, Figured he could make it in the big city where blues and folk music were starting to find white audiences. He married a woman named Martha Promise, who became his anchor and his manager, the one who kept him grounded when the music business tried to chew him up. New York was different from anything he'd known. Fast, loud, crowded with ambition and talent and people all scrambling for the same spotlight. Ledbetter played in Greenwich Village clubs, at Communist Party gatherings. The left loved folk music, saw it as the voice of the oppressed, at schools and libraries and anywhere else that would book him. He became friends with Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Josh White, the young folk singers who saw him as a legend, a direct link to the authentic American music they were trying to preserve and promote. They learned from him, borrowed from him, absorbed his style and his songs and his spirit. Ledbetter taught them, but he also learned from them. Learned about the folk music revival happening among white audiences, about the political power of song, about how music could be protest and art at the same time. He started writing more topical songs about racism, about injustice, about the struggles of black folks in America. His music evolved while staying rooted in the traditions he'd learned as a boy. But success, real financial success, kept eluding him. He played constantly, recorded for various labels, had a regular spot on radio, but the money never matched his talent or his influence. Part of it was racism. Black folk musicians in the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds didn't get the same pay or the same opportunities as white performers. Part of it was the business itself, which had always been designed to exploit artists, especially artists who didn't have lawyers and contracts protecting them. Ledbetter kept performing through the 1,940 seconds. He played benefits for the war effort, sang for soldiers, toured the country showing America its own musical heritage. He was respected, admired, called a living legend, but legends don't pay rent. In 1949, his health started failing. Decades of hard labor, hard living, and hard times had worn his body down. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, a slow death sentence that gradually stripped away his strength, his mobility, his ability to play guitar. Martha cared for him at home in New York. Friends visited, bringing food and money and prayers. Pete Seeger came by, brought his banjo, played songs with Ledbetter, who could barely hold his own instrument anymore. They sang together like that, old man and young, the past and the future of American folk music sitting in a small apartment while the city roared outside. Ledbetter died on the 6th of December 1949 at Bellevue Hospital. He was 61 years old. The funeral was small, mostly friends and family, a few musicians who'd loved him. They buried him in the Shiloh Baptist Church Cemetery in Louisiana, back where it all began, under a simple stone that said his name and nothing more. He died believing his music would be forgotten, died thinking he'd never gotten the recognition he deserved, died broke, tired, worn down by a life that had been beautiful and brutal in equal measure. And then, 6 months later, everything changed. The Weavers, a folk group featuring Pete Seeger, recorded "Goodnight Irene." It was released in 1950 and became a massive hit, topping the charts for 13 weeks, selling 2 million copies. Suddenly, everyone in America was singing the song Ledbetter had played for years to scattered applause. Other artists rushed to record it. Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Ernest Tubb, they all did versions. The song became a standard, a classic, one of those melodies so embedded in American culture that people forgot where it came from. The money from those recordings, millions and millions of dollars, went to publishers, to labels, to everyone except the man who'd written and popularized it. Ledbetter's family got almost nothing. His widow, Martha, tried to fight for royalties but lacked the resources to take on the music industry. "Goodnight Irene" made Ledbetter famous after death in a way he never was while living. It brought attention to his other songs, which were also recorded by hundreds of artists over the decades. The Midnight Special, Rock Island Line, Cotton Fields, songs he'd sung in prison yards and juke joints, now playing on radios across the world. His influence spread like ripples in water. Rock and roll pioneers like Elvis and Johnny Cash covered his songs. The Beatles studied his style. Bob Dylan called him a hero. Every folk revival, every blues renaissance, Every rediscovery of American roots music led back to Leadbelly. But the man himself was gone, never got to see his legacy, never got to taste the fame and fortune his music eventually generated, never got to stand on a stage and hear thousands of people singing his words back to him. That's the ghost of justice, right there. Leadbelly sang himself out of prison twice, survived things that should have killed him, created art that would outlive everyone who ever heard him play. But justice, real justice, the kind that means a man gets what he's earned, never quite caught up to him while he was alive to enjoy it. Some nights, when I'm sitting on my porch and the radio's playing something old and blue, I think about Leadbelly, think about how he died believing his life's work wouldn't matter, wouldn't last. And I wonder if he knows now, wherever he is, that his voice is still singing, still moving people, still bearing witness to a time and a struggle most folks would rather forget. I like to think he does. I like to think somewhere in some juke joint in the sky, Leadbelly's got his 12-string and he's playing for a crowd that finally understands exactly how great he was. And maybe, just maybe, Justice finally bought him a drink and said, "Sorry I'm late." There's a question folks love to ask about the blues. Is it music or is it history? And the answer any bluesman worth his salt will tell you is, yes. The blues aren't just songs, they're witnesses. Court testimonies written in melody, historical records sung in 3 chords, evidence of crimes committed and survived that never made it into the official ledgers. When the history books leave you out, when the newspapers ignore your pain, when the law treats you like property instead of people, that's when the blues step in and say, "I'll remember. I'll tell the story. I'll make sure the truth don't die." Leadbelly understood that from the beginning. He wasn't just entertaining, he was documenting. Every work song he sang carried the rhythm of men in chains. Every prison ballad preserved the names of men nobody else would remember. Every blues he played testified to the reality of black life in the Jim Crow South, the danger, the suffering, the small moments of joy stolen from a world designed to crush you. Take The Midnight Special, one of his most famous recordings. On the surface, it's about a train whose light shines into a prison, bringing hope to the convicts. But listen closer, and you hear the real story about men trapped in a system that treats them as less than human, about the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, something outside those walls will set them free. It's not just a song. It's a prayer sung by thousands of men who'd never see their names in print. Or Cotton Fields, which sounds nostalgic until you realize it's about backbreaking labor and killing heat, about children working alongside their parents because survival required every hand. It's testimony disguised as melody. Or his ballads about outlaws and bad men, not glorifying them, but explaining them, showing how poverty and racism could turn a good man mean, how desperation could make monsters, how the South created the very criminals it then used to justify its violence. Those songs were sociology before anybody called it that, anthropology dressed in 3-minute performances. The prison farms Leadbelly sang about Angola, Sugarland, Parchman, all the hellholes scattered across the South were America's dirty secret. Slavery had ended on paper, but convict leasing brought it back with a new name. Black men arrested on flimsy charges or no charges at all, sentenced to years of hard labor, leased out to plantations and timber companies and railroads that worked them to death and replaced them the next day. It was systematic, it was brutal, and it was invisible to most white Americans who didn't want to know what funded their roads and buildings. Leadbelly's songs made it visible, not to everyone, not right away, but eventually. When folklorists like the Lomaxes recorded him, when his music reached audiences beyond the South, people heard the truth in his voice. They heard what the chain gang really was. They heard what it meant to be black in a justice system designed to consume you. During the folk revival of the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, young white musicians discovered Leadbelly's recordings and were horrified. This is what America did. This is what happened in those prisons. They'd grown up with sanitized history, with textbooks that skipped from slavery to civil rights like nothing happened in between. Leadbelly's music filled in those gaps, showed them the continuity of oppression, made them understand that the past wasn't past at all. It was still happening, just with different names. Pete Seeger used to tell a story about playing lead belly songs for college students in the 1,950 seconds. After one performance, a white kid came up to him, face pale, and said, "I had no idea. Nobody ever told us it was like that." And Pete would say, "That's why we sing these songs, because if we don't, who will remember?" That's the power of blues as testimony. It preserves what the powerful want forgotten. It gives voice to the voiceless. It makes personal what society wants to keep abstract. When Lead Belly sang about prison, he wasn't talking about some generic concept of incarceration. He was talking about specific guards with specific names who committed specific cruelties. He was naming dates and places and people. He was saying, "This happened. I was there. I survived to tell you about it. And if you have any decency at all, you'll listen." The folk music movement understood this, which is why they embraced Lead Belly's legacy so fiercely after his death. They saw his songs as tools for change, weapons against injustice, proof that the system needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Artists like Odetta, Harry Belafonte, Joan Baez, they all sang Lead Belly's songs as acts of protest, as calls to action. But here's what made Lead Belly's testimony even more powerful. He didn't simplify things. He didn't paint everyone in prison as innocent. Didn't pretend the system was the only problem. He sang about his own violence, his own mistakes, his own guilt. He sang about men in prison who deserved to be there and men who didn't. About guards who were cruel and guards who were human. About a system that was irredeemably broken and individuals within it who occasionally showed mercy. That nuance made his testimony believable. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was demanding acknowledgement. He was saying, "Look at what this place does to people, all people, guilty and innocent alike. Look at how it grinds them down, takes away their humanity, turns men into animals and then punishes them for behaving like animals." His work songs, "Take This Hammer," "Pick a Bale of Cotton," Julie Ann Johnson. These weren't celebrating labor. They were showing how rhythm was used as a tool of control, how song was both a gift and a chain, how even music could be weaponized by a system that understood its power. And his redemption songs, the ones about reform, about second chances, about the possibility of change, they testified to the human spirit's refusal to be completely broken. They said, "You can chain my body, you can steal my years, you can treat me like dirt, but you cannot kill the part of me that hopes, that believes, that knows I'm worth more than what you've decided I am." That message resonated far beyond the blues community. Civil rights activists sang Lead Belly's songs during marches. Freedom riders played his recordings on long bus trips through hostile territory. Protesters adapted his melodies to their own struggles. The blues became a template for resistance, a proof that music could both bear witness and inspire change. In the 1,990 seconds, scholars started taking another look at the convict lease system, at the prison farms, at the systematic brutality that had been hidden behind euphemisms and bureaucracy. And guess what they used as primary sources? Lead Belly's songs. His recordings became historical evidence, cited in academic papers, used to document conditions that official records deliberately obscured. That's the ultimate vindication of blues as testimony. What society dismissed as entertainment, what critics called primitive or unsophisticated, turned out to be some of the most accurate historical documentation of an era. Lead Belly wasn't just a musician. He was a historian, an archivist, a keeper of truths that would have died without him. I think about this sometimes when I hear modern musicians sampling his songs, using his melodies, borrowing his style. They're building on testimony, standing on shoulders that bore witness to things they'll never experience. And that's good. That's how culture works, how truth gets passed down, how the dead continue to speak to the living. But I also think about what it cost him, the weight of carrying all those stories, all those names, all that pain. The burden of being not just an artist, but a witness. Not just a performer, but a prophet. The toll it took on his soul to live through hell twice and then have to sing about it for audiences who could never fully understand. That's the price of testimony. The truth teller never gets to forget. They carry the story until it's told, and even after, it doesn't leave them. It lives in their bones, their blood, their dreams. They're haunted by what they've seen, compelled to bear witness even when it hurts, even when nobody wants to hear it, even when the telling costs them everything. Ledbetter paid that price, and because he did, we know what happened in those prison farms. We know what the chain gang really was. We know the names of men who would otherwise be forgotten. We know the truth about a system that tried to hide itself behind walls and laws and the silence of the dead. The blues survived. The testimony survived. And as long as somebody's playing a 12-string guitar and singing about hard times and second chances, Ledbetter's witness continues. That's not justice. Exactly. But it's something justice owes a debt, too, because you can't fix what you refuse to see, can't change what you won't acknowledge, can't heal what you keep hidden. Ledbetter made it visible, made it undeniable, made it sing. And in the end, that might be the most revolutionary thing a man can do. They say music's got healing power, but that ain't quite right. Music doesn't heal, it transforms. Takes the pain and turns it into something beautiful, something bearable, something that means the suffering wasn't for nothing. That's what Ledbetter understood better than most, that the point wasn't to forget what hurt you, but to turn it into testimony so powerful that nobody else could forget either. I've spent a long time thinking about Ledbetter's life, trying to understand what it all means. Born on the borderline between slavery and freedom, spent years in chains, sang himself out twice, died broke while his music made millions for others. From any angle, that's a tragedy. But it's also something else. It's a victory of the kind most folks don't recognize. See, Ledbetter never stopped being himself. The prisons tried to break him. Poverty tried to silence him. Racism tried to crush him. The music industry tried to exploit him. But through all of it, he kept that 12-string guitar in his hands and his voice raised to the sky. He never let anyone tell him who he was or what his music meant. He sang what he wanted, how he wanted, for whoever would listen. That's freedom of the truest kind. Not the legal kind that comes with paperwork and pardons, but the soul-deep kind that says, "You don't own me. You can chain my body, but my spirit answers to something higher." The two pardons from Texas Governor Pat Neff in 1925 and Louisiana Governor O.K. Allen in 1934, they're the headline of his story. Man sings himself out of prison. Not once, but twice. It sounds like something from a tall tale, something too perfect to be true. But it was true, and it happened because Ledbetter understood something fundamental about human nature. We're all prisoners of something, and music is one of the few keys that opens locks from the inside. When he sang for those governors, he wasn't just performing. He was showing them their own humanity reflected back at them, making them remember that the man in chains was still a man, that talent and dignity don't disappear behind bars, that mercy is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can grant. He was giving them the chance to be better than the system they represented, and they took it. Not because they had to, not because it was politically expedient, though that helped, but because the music reached something in them that policy and procedure couldn't touch. That's the magic of it. The song that saved Ledbetter's life also saved something in those governors' souls, reminded them what compassion looked like in action. But here's what really matters. Ledbetter saved himself long before those pardons came through. He saved himself every time. He picked up his guitar in a prison yard and reminded himself and everyone listening that they were human beings, not livestock. Every time he turned suffering into song, he was committing an act of resistance, of preservation, of triumph. The chains could hold his body, but they couldn't hold his music. And as long as the music lived, so did he. After his death, when Goodnight Irene became a hit, and his other songs started getting recorded by everyone from folk singers to rock stars, some people said it was unfair that he didn't live to see it. And yeah, it is unfair. He deserved to taste that success, to hear his songs on the radio, to walk into a room and have people recognize him as the legend he was. But I don't think Ledbetter would have been surprised by the timing. He knew how the South worked, knew how America treated black artists, knew that recognition often comes after death, because that's when you stop being threatening and start being safe to celebrate. He'd lived his whole life in that contradiction, admired for his talent, feared for his power, used for his music, discarded when convenient. What he did get to see was the impact his music had on individuals, the prisoners who found hope in his songs, the young folk singers who learned from him, the audiences who heard him perform and came away changed. The people who told him face to face that his music had saved them or moved them or made them see the world differently. That's the reward that mattered, the payment that couldn't be put in a bank but was worth more than gold. In the years since his death, Ledbelly's legacy has only grown. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Louisiana Music Hall of Fame, the Grammy Hall of Fame. His songs have been recorded thousands of times by hundreds of artists. Scholars write dissertations about him. Documentaries tell his story, museums display his guitars like holy relics. But the real legacy isn't in the accolades or the covers, academic papers. It's in the fact that somewhere right now, somebody's learning to play guitar and Midnight Special is one of the first songs they master. It's in the fact that protest movements still sing his melodies when they march. It's in the fact that any serious student of American music has to reckon with Ledbelly, has to understand that the blues didn't come from nowhere. They came from men like him, who took their pain and made it into art so powerful it could unlock prison doors. That 12-string guitar he played, the Stella he called his favorite, it survived him. Now it sits in a museum, strings silent, wood worn smooth by his hands. People come to see it, stand there looking at this object that witnessed everything, that felt his fingers dance across it in prison yards and concert halls and late-night recording sessions. It's a relic, sure, but it's also proof. Proof that the music was real, that the man was real, that everything he survived and sang about actually happened. Sometimes I imagine what I'd say if I could talk to Ledbelly now. I'd tell him the pardons were just the beginning, that the real victory was what he did with the time he got. I'd tell him, "Good night, Irene" is still being sung, still making people cry, still carrying his voice into living rooms across the world. I'd tell him the young musicians who study his style, who learn his songs, who try to capture even a fraction of what he had, they're keeping him alive in ways a marble statue never could. But mostly I'd thank him for not giving up, for turning his hell into our history, for showing that a song really can save your life if you pour enough of your soul into it, for proving that the blues aren't about staying down, they're about standing up one more time than you're knocked down, about bearing witness when silence is easier, about turning pain into something beautiful because that's the only revenge we get against a world that wants to break us. Ledbelly's story is about a lot of things, music and racism and justice and redemption, but at its core, it's about the human spirit's refusal to be conquered, about the power of art to transcend the circumstances that create it, about how a voice raised in song can be the freest thing in the world, even when everything else is chained. They called him Ledbelly because he was tough, because he survived things that should have killed him. But I think it was also because he carried the weight of his people's story in his gut, in his bones, in his blood, and he carried it all the way to the end, never dropped it, never lightened the load, by forgetting or lying or sanitizing the truth. That's the song that saved his soul, not any single melody, but the act of singing itself. The decision to turn suffering into testimony, to make beauty from brutality, to insist that his life meant something even when the world insisted it didn't. He sang himself out of prison twice. But more than that, he sang himself into immortality. And every time somebody picks up a guitar and plays one of his songs, every time somebody learns his story and shares it, every time the blues ring out in a voice that refuses to be silent, that's Ledbelly being pardoned again, freed again, alive again. The chain gangs are gone now. The prison farms have been reformed or shut down. The governors who pardoned him are long dead. But the music endures. And somewhere, I like to think, Ledbelly's sitting with his 12-string, grinning that sly grin of his, finally understanding that the song didn't just save his life, it saved his soul. And in doing so, it helped save all of ours too. Because that's what the blues do. They remind us we're human when the world tries to make us forget. They give voice to the voiceless when silence seems like the only option. They bear witness when the powerful want history rewritten. They transform suffering into something transcendent. And they endure. God help us. they endure. So the next time you hear "Good Night Irene" on the radio, or you see somebody playing a 12-string guitar, or you hear a voice raised in song about hard times and second chances, remember Leadbelly. Remember the man who sang himself free. Remember the power of music to unlock chains nobody else can see. Remember that in the deep South, where stories run thick as molasses and the past still whispers through the cypress and magnolia, some voices refuse to be silenced. Some songs are stronger than steel. Some souls are too bright to be contained by the darkness that tried to swallow them. Leadbelly's one of them. And his song, Lord Have Mercy, his song still echoes, still saves, still sets us free. This has been the Dixie Tales. Thanks for listening, y'all. And remember, keep your guitar close, your head down, and your voice raised. You never know when a song might save your life.